To understand Ernest Chilly Willy Thomas and Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, one must understand the soil that grew them. Born in an era of rigid Jim Crow segregation in the American South, both men grew up in a world where the law was often a weapon used against them rather than a shield for them. Thomas, a man of grit and tactical thinking, and Kirkpatrick, a minister with a booming voice and a musician's soul, were shaped by the duality of black life in Louisiana. Deep community faith on one side and the constant shadow of the Ku Klux Klan on the other. Many members of what would become the Deacons for Defense and Justice were veterans of World War II and the Korean War. They had traveled abroad to fight for democracy, only to return home to a state where they couldn't vote or sit at a lunch counter. This paradox forged a specific type of resolve. They were trained in weaponry and tactics, and they possessed a psychological fearlessness that the local power structures weren't prepared to handle. They didn't just want change, they felt they had earned the right to demand it. The boiling point in Jonesboro, Louisiana. By 1964, the atmosphere in Jonesboro, Louisiana was electric with tension. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, had arrived to set up a freedom house to help black citizens register to vote. In response, the Ku Klux Klan unleashed a campaign of unbridled terror. In a short span, they burned 5 black churches, a Masonic hall, and a Baptist center. The most chilling aspect was the complicity of the law. The Klan frequently paraded through black neighborhoods with a police escort, sometimes led by the assistant police chief himself. Ernest Thomas and his peers realized that the federal government was too slow and the local government was too hostile to protect them. On July 10, 1964, Thomas and Kirkpatrick gathered a group of men and made a revolutionary decision. They would no longer be victims. They formed the Deacons for Defense and Justice. They didn't see themselves as a militia in the aggressive sense. They saw themselves as deacons, servants of the community, whose duty was to protect the flock. The strategy of armed defense. The Deacons were meticulous. They wore overalls and caps, blending into the working-class community, but they carried pistols and shotguns. Their philosophy was simple: we will not start a fight, but we will finish one. When the Klan attempted to harass civil rights workers at the Freedom House, they found themselves staring into the barrels of the Deacons' guns. For the first time, the bullies of the South faced a consequence they understood. The movement quickly expanded to Bogalusa, Louisiana, which was then one of the most dangerous cities for activists. There, the Deacons provided a 24-hour security detail for leaders like James Farmer Jr. They guarded marches, protected the homes of activists, and patrolled neighborhoods. Their presence created a protected space where nonviolent protest could actually function. Without the Deacons, the nonviolent movement in Louisiana might have been extinguished by bloodshed. The clash with the establishment. The Deacons' success was a double-edged sword. While they saved lives, they terrified the white establishment and even made some mainstream civil rights leaders uncomfortable. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, didn't view them as protectors. They viewed them as a threat to the status quo and opened investigations into the group. Even organizations like the NAACP and SCLC were often silent, fearing that the image of black men with guns would alienate white Northern supporters. However, the results were undeniable. In Bogalusa, the Deacons' refusal to back down forced Governor McKeithen to do something no other Deep South governor had done: publicly intervene to stop Klan violence to avoid a full-scale race war. The Deacons proved that while nonviolence appealed to the conscience of the nation, self-defense ensured that the voices of the brave aren't silenced forever. Transitions and later life. As the 1960s progressed, the Deacons' influence began to wane as the Black Power movement emerged, adopting many of their ideas but with a more radical political rhetoric. By 1968, the formal organization began to fade, but the men behind it continued their work in different ways. Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick moved toward a life of cultural activism. He became a renowned folk singer and co-founded the Poor People's Campaign with Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy. He spent his later years using music as a tool for liberation, proving that the same hands that could hold a gun could also pluck a guitar for justice. He passed away in 1986, leaving behind a legacy of spiritual and physical resistance. Ernest Thomas remained a figure of quiet strength, though he lived much of his later life out of the national spotlight. He stayed true to his conviction that a man must be able to protect his family and his dignity. The Deacons were largely erased from the sanitized version of the civil rights movement for decades, only being revived in the public consciousness by the 2003 film Deacons for Defense. A multifaceted liberation. The story of the Deacons for Defense and Justice teaches us that liberation is rarely a single-track journey. It requires a diversity of tactics. It requires the dreamer who marches and the sentry who watches the door. The Deacons didn't oppose Dr. King, they made his work possible. They were the hard shell that protected the soft heart of the movement. They lived as men who refused to be terrorized, and they died as heroes who redefined what it meant to be a citizen. Their lives remind us that peace is not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And sometimes, justice requires someone willing to say, "This far and no further." The story of the Deacons for Defense teaches us that peace is not just the absence of violence, but the presence of justice. While nonviolence speaks to the conscience of the world, self-defense ensures that the voices of the brave aren't silenced forever. They showed us that true liberation requires both the courage to march peacefully and the strength to stand firm when faced with hate. Their legacy is a reminder. Dignity is worth defending, and sometimes change requires someone willing to say, "This far and no further."